At roughly early afternoon Eastern Time on Saturday, a patchwork of Syrian geography turned into a single American sentence written in fire: multiple strikes, spread across a country that never stays in one piece long enough for neat headlines. It lands in the shadow of December 13th, when two U.S. service members and an American civilian interpreter were killed near Palmyra, a reminder that in Syria, even a remnant can still draw blood. And the uncomfortable question isn't whether the U.S. can hit ISIS again, it's what price the region is being told to accept for the privilege of not falling apart. Deterrence just got repriced. Retaliation is never closure, it's a subscription. Here's the part people miss. The louder the word ISIS gets, the quieter the real mechanism becomes. When the U.S. hits targets throughout Syria, it's not only trying to erase a network, it's trying to reset the exchange rate of risk for everyone watching. Damascus, the Kurdish forces in the northeast, Jordan, Turkey, Iran's shadow ecosystem, and the small remaining Russian footprint that still stains the coastline like old ink that won't wash out. The strike is kinetic, but the effect they're buying is psychological. Make the next would-be attacker calculate again, make the next partner believe again, make the next fence-sitter pick a side again. And that is why these operations always feel like they re-aimed at two enemies at once. ISIS is the visible enemy. Uncertainty is the real one. The U.S. doesn't publish the full ledger immediately. No detailed casualty numbers, no neat scorecard, no cinematic mission accomplished arc, because modern counterterror is not designed to look like victory. It's designed to look like inevitability. A system that keeps moving, keeps finding, keeps striking, keeps reminding. You can run, but you can't hide. But reversal logic is the trapdoor beneath that confidence. The more precise the strike, the less certain the outcome. Because ISIS isn't a conventional army you defeat. It's an infection that survives by changing its shape, faster than institutions can change their paperwork. You can destroy a building, you can crater a weapons cache, you can remove a commander, but you can't bomb the incentives that make a failed space profitable to extremists. Syria is still a marketplace of power where everyone pays in a different currency. Damascus wants legitimacy and sanctions relief, and it wants to look like a state again: one flag, one chain of command, one monopoly on violence, the basic furniture of sovereignty. The Kurdish-led forces want security guarantees and autonomy because they've learned the oldest lesson in the region: if you don't hold a piece of ground yourself, someone else will hold it for you. Jordan wants the border to stop leaking weapons, fighters, and chaos into its bloodstream. Turkey wants the Kurdish file contained. The U.S. wants ISIS kept down without inheriting the whole Syrian tragedy again. Same battlefield, different receipts. So when strikes hit multiple targets across Syria, the message is layered: to ISIS, you don't get to rest. To partners, we still show up. To the Syrian government, cooperation comes with terms, and those terms will be enforced in real time, not in. And to everyone else, the U.S. still reserves the right to act inside your map when its people are killed. That last part is the one that should make you sit up, because sovereignty in the Middle East isn't a wall, it's a negotiation. And negotiations get rewritten when blood is spilled. The December 13th attack near Palmyra wasn't just a tactical incident. It was a strategic insult. It told every actor in Syria that there are still gaps in the security fabric, gaps wide enough for a gunman to walk through and change U.S. policy tempo. You can call ISIS degraded, you can call it fragmented, you can call it hunted. But it still managed to send Washington an invoice, so Washington answers with something that looks like vengeance on the surface and something else underneath. A demonstration that the U.S. can still scale force quickly in a theater it claims it doesn't want to own. That's the dual-line contrast that defines American power in 2026. America can leave, America can return faster. This is why the timeline matters. Operation Hawkeye Strike begins in December with large-scale strikes, dozens of targets, a heavy initial punch, a show of capacity, and then comes the follow-on wave, another set of strikes, another reminder that the first night wasn't a one-off emotional reaction, it was the beginning of a cycle. The cycle is the point, because ISIS studies cycles. It studies attention spans. It studies political calendars. It studies the distance between outrage and fatigue. ISIS doesn't need to defeat the U.S. militarily. It just needs the U.S. to look away at the wrong time, the way people look away from a small leak until the ceiling collapses, and the U.S. knows that. So the strike isn't only punishment for what happened in Palmyra, it's insurance against what might happen when the world gets distracted, when elections, markets, and domestic crises Steal oxygen, and Syria becomes that problem in the background again. Here's where the story becomes colder. The U.S. has about 1,000 troops still in Syria, not an invasion force, not an occupying army. More like a thin wire stretched across a fault line, enough to triple arms, enough to coordinate raids, enough to keep partner forces tied into American intelligence and air power, enough to keep ISIS from holding major ground, but also enough to create political liability, because when you station a small number of troops in a high volatility environment, every incident becomes disproportionate, every death becomes strategic, every ambush becomes a referendum, and every retaliation becomes a signal that must travel farther than the crater it leaves behind. That's why the operation is paired with language, not just "we struck targets," but the implied promise behind it: you harm Americans, you will be hunted. It's a narrative meant to outlast the smoke, but narratives degrade too, especially in Syria, where reality has a way of rubbing slogans into dust. So the real question is not whether these strikes hit ISIS targets. The real question is what kind of Syria the U.S. is choosing to help create while it hunts ISIS, because the post-Assad environment is not a blank page, it's a half-burned manuscript. The new leadership in Damascus wants to prove it can be the central node again. Washington, meanwhile, is balancing a dangerous contradiction. It wants a Syrian state strong enough to suppress ISIS, but not hostile enough to become a long-term adversary, and not so weak that the country fractures into permanent warlord economics. That is a narrow corridor, and corridors in the Middle East are where people get ambushed. There's also the awkward fact that everyone's definition of stability is self-serving. A government can call its consolidation order, a minority can call it erasure, an external power can call it strikes counterterrorism, a local can call them a reminder that we don't fully own our sky. All true, all incompatible. So if you're looking for a clean moral story, you won't find it here, you'll find a mechanical one. ISIS survives and seems between local forces and central control, between ideology and criminal enterprise, between desert and city, between border and bureaucracy. Counterterrorism is seam management. It's stitching, restitching, and sometimes cauterizing, and cauterizing always leaves scars. That is the slow knife in this moment. These strikes are not a turning point, they are maintenance, and maintenance is what you do when you've accepted that the machine is not going to stop breaking. You can feel that in how little the public gets at first. Broad statements, limited detail, a refusal to offer a neat before and after. Because the U.S. doesn't want the story to become about a single battle damage assessment, it wants the story to become about permanence, and permanence is exactly what ISIS tries to undermine, not by winning fights, but by making the fight feel endless. So here is the uncomfortable thesis to hold on to as the smoke clears. The strike is not only aimed at ISIS fighters and caches, it's aimed at the market for doubt. If the region believes the U.S. response is automatic, ISIS loses leverage. If the region believes the U.S. response is political and delayed, ISIS gains oxygen. That's why timing matters. That's why scale matters. That's why partner participation matters. Even the quiet detail that Jordan joined? The strike isn't a footnote, it's part of the message architecture. A chorus sounds stronger than a solo, even if the bombs are American, and yet the vacuum sentence still waits at the edge of all of this, and then the numbers stop adding up, because every strike buys time, but time is not a strategy. Time is what you spend while you search for one, and Syria is the place where time gets stolen. One ambush, one prison break, one collapse checkpoint, one bad bargain at a time. So yes, the U.S. struck ISIS in Syria, but the bigger story is that the Middle East is being quietly repriced again, what it costs to protect Americans, what it costs to stabilize a post-war state, what it costs to keep an ended terror group from reappearing under a new name in a familiar desert. The crater is the headline, the ledger is the reality. In 2014, the world watched ISIS take cities the way a wildfire takes dry grass, fast, loud, and with an arrogance that made governments look like paperwork. The response came in waves, coalitions formed, airstrikes intensified, partner forces advanced, and the map slowly stopped bleeding black, and then, quietly, the story changed from defeat to management because the enemy didn't die, it learned to live smaller. That's the historical trap. The more you celebrate the collapse of the caliphate, the more you forget what actually powered it, seems, not territory. Ungoverned space, compromised checkpoints, prisons that became universities, local grudges that never made it into English language briefings. ISIS didn't need a capital to function. It needed a rhythm, and Syria always provides rhythm, because Syria isn't one country in practice, it's a stack of overlapping systems pretending to share a flag. When pressure rises, those systems don't unite, they shed weight, they simplify, they outsource, and what falls off the truck is exactly what extremist networks pick up. That is why today a strike matters less as a single event and more as a familiar signature. Look at the small signals that arrived before the headline, the ones that never trend because they don't have video. First, the enemy didn't reappear with tanks or banners. It reappeared as a human glitch inside the host system, a lone ISIS gunman moving through routine and access close enough to kill Americans near Palmyra and still look for a moment like part of the background. That's not just terrorism, that's infiltration, that's the kind of attack that says the battlefield isn't out there. It's inside the institutions that are supposed to contain it. Second, the response didn't look like a new war. It looked like an old toolkit being pulled out of storage and plugged back in. If you recall, there was a first wave of airstrikes, and it wasn't symbolic, it was scale, it was repetition, it was the message that the U.S. can still flip the switch fast, and that the switch still works. F-15E Strike Eagles, A-10 Warthogs, Army Apache helicopter gunships, the familiar cast returning to a theater everyone claims they want to move past. Third, the operation is no longer happening in a frozen diplomatic time capsule. The region's relationships are shifting under the table. The U.S. is working closer with Syria's government while still relying on partner forces and still navigating a crowded sky that sounds like progress in press statements. In reality, it's a high-wire act, you're trying to crush ISIS while building a new balance of legitimacy in Damascus, and you're doing it with limited trust and a memory of betrayal on all sides. Put those signals side by side, and the pattern becomes obvious. The strike isn't a spike. It's a pulse. Now zoom out, because Syria is never just Syria. Every major actor reads this moment as a pricing event, an update to what power costs and what power can buy. For Jordan, participation or support is not a footnote. It's a shield. Syria's eastern deserts and border corridors have always been a pressure valve, and when that valve leaks, Jordan absorbs the poison: smuggling, weapons, fighters, instability. So when the question hangs in the air, remains to be seen if the Jordanians assisted this time, that uncertainty itself is part of the theater. Even the possibility of Jordan's involvement tells ISIS and everyone else that the perimeter is harder than it looks. For the new Syrian leadership, cooperating against ISIS is a bid for legitimacy, but also a test. If Damascus can present itself as the central node again, the state that can coordinate, arrest, disrupt, then every U.S. strike becomes an indirect endorsement of a new Syrian order, and if it fails, every U.S. strike becomes proof that Syria still doesn't fully own its own sky. For the Kurdish-led forces, this is where trust gets audited. They've been the long-term ground partner against ISIS, but they also know how quickly partnerships can be relabeled when diplomatic needs change. A U.S. strike can feel like protection one day and like leverage the next. In Syria, even air support has a shadow. For Russia, the story didn't end when its influence shrank. They still operate a base in Syria. That means every strike has an extra layer, not just target selection, but airspace discipline. Not just can we hit, but can we hit without triggering an accident that becomes a crisis. The old reality returns in a single grim line. There was a deconfliction mechanism, sometimes just an unclassified mobile phone and a Gmail account, because in Syria, the most dangerous thing is not the enemy you're hunting, it's the other armed powers you're not trying to fight. And for Washington, the strike is a way to keep multiple clocks aligned: deterrence, domestic politics, alliance credibility, and the simple moral arithmetic of responding when Americans are killed. Which brings us to the market reaction, because, yes, there is a market here, even if it doesn't trade on CNBC. The first market is the militia market. Armed groups watch how quickly America responds, how broadly it strikes, and how long it sustains pressure. They are not asking, is the U.S. angry? They are asking, is the U.S. consistent? Consistency is what changes behavior. Anger is what makes headlines. The second market is the governance market. Local officials, security services, and commanders adjust their loyalty when they sense momentum shifting. A strike that looks like commitment can stiffen spines. A strike that looks like a one-off can loosen them. ISIS thrives when governance becomes negotiable. The third market is the narrative market. ISIS recruits on the claim that the system is fake, that states are hollow, that the West is temporary. Every time the U.S. hits hard, It disrupts operations, but it also fuels the propaganda machine if the underlying grievances remain untouched. Counterterror is always trading into currencies at once, firepower and meaning, and this is where the coldest truth sits. Payback is not strategy, it's a reaction dressed in uniform. The transcript says the quiet part out loud. Officials say this is payback and then sharpens it again, the payback, the vengeance if you will, because that's how the public understands cause and effect. Someone hits you, you hit back, but states don't get the luxury of simple emotions. States have to convert emotion into policy without letting policy become emotion, and the reason that is hard right now is because the system has fewer policy options than it wants to admit. A full-scale occupation is politically impossible, militarily wasteful, and strategically radioactive. A total withdrawal is a temptation with a hangover because the vacuum doesn't stay empty, and ISIS has always been a specialist in renting empty rooms. A massive aid and rebuild project is fantasy while legitimacy is contested and resources are finite. Even a hands-off containment posture has a cost. It makes small U.S. footprints more vulnerable, and every casualty forces escalation anyway. So what's left? Precision, partners, persistent pressure. In other words, a revaluation of how control is exercised, less territory, more targeting, less visibility, more intelligence, fewer speeches, more strikes. The state becomes a surgeon because it can't afford to be an army, but surgeons still bleed, and in Syria, the bleeding is often political. Because the more Washington coordinates with Damascus to root out ISIS, the more it inherits Damascus's contradictions, the more it relies on Kurdish forces, the more it irritates Turkey. The more it strikes across Syria, the more it must manage airspace with other powers. Every tactical action drags a diplomatic tail behind it. This is the inescapable pattern. Counterterror in Syria is not a war you win, it's a balance you keep rebalancing. The first strike teaches the enemy where you can reach, the second strike teaches the region whether you'll return, and then the silence grows again, because ISIS doesn't need to beat you today. It needs to survive you until tomorrow, until headlines move, until budgets shift, until attention breaks, until one checkpoint gets lazy, until one insider opens one door. You can feel that future without predicting it. The mechanism gives it away. When a system is stretched thin, it doesn't snap where it's strongest, it snaps where it's routine. So when people look at this and ask, did it work? They're asking the wrong question. The correct question is, what did it force everyone to believe? Because belief shapes behavior faster than rubble does. And that is why the most telling detail in the transcript isn't even about the weapons, it's the banality surrounding power. The schedule for President Trump is pretty light, a dentist appointment, and the suggestion that a leader might be watching the region through a phone while the aircraft are still in the air. Modern war doesn't always feel like war. Sometimes it feels like notifications between errands, and then the numbers stop feeling like numbers, because the enemy learns, the partners hedge, the system adapts, and the cycle resumes. What happened in Syria is not a single strike, it is a recalibration of what the U.S. is willing to do, how fast it is willing to do it, and how publicly it is willing to own it. On January 10th, the Pentagon confirmed multiple strikes across Syria against ISIS, with details still deliberately thin because the intent is not a cinematic victory, it is to reassert a rule in a region where rules dissolve the moment nobody enforces them. The sky wrote the reminder. The mechanism is simple and brutal. ISIS survives on seams, and seams multiply when a country changes hands, when armies merge, when prisons overflow, when borders become business models, when legitimacy is traded like counterfeit currency. The U.S. response is not designed to solve Syria because it cannot, not at an acceptable cost, not with a footprint of roughly 1,000 troops and a political appetite that evaporates the moment casualties return home. So Washington chooses a narrower lever, persistent pressure that keeps ISIS from consolidating and keeps partners from panicking. That is why this story is not about aircraft. It is about psychology and the way power trains everyone's expectations. Retaliation in this context is a pricing tool. You hit Americans in Palmyra, and the price of future attacks goes up for anyone thinking about copying it. You make partners look incompetent, and the price of sheltering extremists goes up for anyone who wants access, funding, legitimacy. You test the new Syrian order, and the price of tolerating ISIS cells inside security structures goes up for Damascus itself. The strike is a receipt. It tells the region what Washington considers non-negotiable. Then you watch what moves immediately, before civilians even hear the details. First-order impact hits the system, not the headlines. It tightens airspace discipline because Syria is still a crowded ceiling and miscalculation is an enemy that requires no ideology. It forces partner forces to lean back into intelligence sharing because the difference between a remnant and a resurgence is often a single uncovered logistics corridor. It pushes ISIS into deeper concealment, which can reduce large attacks but increase smaller, more frequent violence, the kind that wears out checkpoints and erodes morale. It also shifts how Damascus is perceived. If the U.S. is now coordinating more closely with Syria's government against ISIS, then every successful operation quietly adds a layer of legitimacy to the new leadership. Every failure, every insider attack, every security force defection does the opposite. A government does not inherit credibility, it earns it in the dark. And the region notices the parts that officials do not want to spotlight. Jordan's role matters because it signals a perimeter. Turkey's posture matters because it signals whether Kurdish partners are protected or exposed. Russia's reduced footprint still matters because reduced does not mean absent, and deconfliction remains an unglamorous necessity in a sky where accidents can become policy. This is why one of the most revealing details from the media coverage is still the old image of a deconfliction mechanism that could be as crude as an unclassified mobile phone and a Gmail account. The modern Middle East is not managed by grand strategies alone, it is managed by tiny, fragile channels that prevent the wrong aircraft from becoming the wrong war. Second-order impact lands where people live, and it lands quietly. ISIS does not need to hold cities to harm civilians, it needs to keep communities afraid to cooperate. It needs to punish anyone who talks, it needs to make the state look temporary. When strikes hit ISIS infrastructure, the immediate effect is disruption. The delayed effect is displacement of risk. Cells scatter, pressure relocates, extortion changes hands, local vendettas find new flags to hide behind. Meanwhile, ordinary Syrians get the familiar outcome of every precision campaign in a fractured state, the sensation that life is being decided overhead by actors who can leave whenever they want. Markets reopen and close based on rumors. Roads become safe or unsafe based on which militia is collecting tolls that week. A new government's promise of unity competes with the lived reality of multiple authorities. And for Americans, the reality is colder than the rhetoric. A small force presence does not produce small consequences, it produces fragile consequences. Every patrol becomes a strategic symbol. Every casualty forces the U.S. into a response cycle because credibility, once questioned, becomes expensive to repair. This is the part the public rarely hears plainly. The U.S. is not buying victory, it is buying time. Time for Syrian forces to professionalize without becoming infiltrated. Time for Kurdish and Central forces to stop treating each other like future enemies. Time for borders to become less porous. Time for ISIS leadership to make mistakes. Time for intelligence to accumulate. Time is valuable, but it is not free. Now look at winners and losers, not emotionally, but mechanically. Winners are the actors who thrive in a world where control is exercised through intelligence, surveillance, and selective violence that includes the states and agencies with the best targeting pipelines. It includes regional partners who can convert cooperation into leverage, especially Jordan, which can frame its role as a stabilizing firewall. It includes any Syrian institution that can prove it can purge extremists from its ranks without triggering internal fracture, because credibility is the scarcest resource in a post-regime environment. ISIS loses territory it never fully held in the first place, but it also gains the one thing it always tries to extract from strikes: narrative fuel that only pays off if governance remains broken. Losers are the communities living in seams where ISIS hides and where counter-ISIS operations concentrate. Losers are also the political moderates inside Syria who need stability to sell compromise, because every attack strengthens the argument that only hard power works. And losers include the idea of clean sovereignty, because each strike reinforces the truth everyone already knows and few want to say out loud: Syria's airspace is still not entirely Syria's. Then the timeline becomes visible, not as prophecy, but as a recurring cycle. In the first phase, the system concentrates. After a shock event like the December 13th attack in Palmyra, the response is fast and demonstrative because deterrence depends on speed and clarity. That is where large-scale strikes like the December 19th wave fit, with 70 targets becoming a symbolic number as much as an operational one, and platforms like F-15E strike. Eagles A-10 Warthogs and Army Apache helicopter gunships serving as recognizable signatures of American reach. In this phase, partners align because the fear of ISIS is higher than the fear of each other. In the second phase, the enemy adapts and the system stretches. ISIS reduces surface movement and increases camouflage. Recruitment becomes quieter, more local, more criminal. Insider threats become more valuable than ambushes because infiltration is cheaper than firepower. This is where the U.S. leans harder on raids, arrests, and intelligence-led targeting, and where Damascus is tested on whether it can absorb cooperation without being hollowed out by it. Public attention declines, but operational tempo stays because the danger curve does not follow the news cycle. In the third phase, the region renegotiates control. If Syria's government consolidates, it will push for more formal recognition and more control over partner forces, because sovereignty is a political asset it must display. If it fails, fragmentation hardens and counter-ISIS becomes a long-term maintenance regime. In both cases, the U.S. gradually shifts from dramatic strikes to routine pressure, and routine pressure becomes the real theater, the kind that rarely makes speeches and rarely ends. From above, the pattern is almost clinical. When a state collapses, extremists rush in. When a state rebuilds, extremists burrow in. When outsiders strike, extremists scatter. When outsiders leave, extremists regroup. So the strike is not a conclusion. It is a maintenance signal, delivered in explosions, meant to keep multiple actors behaving inside a narrow corridor of fear and restraint. The soft warning is this: the next meaningful data point will not be the size of the crater. It will be the behavior that follows. Watch the border enforcement, watch the prison management, watch the cooperation between Syrian Central Forces and Kurdish-led units. Watch whether the next ISIS action is loud or whether it becomes a series of small cuts that make the system bleed without noticing. Stay close for the quiet indicators. If the story changes, it will change without announcing itself, and by the time the headline catches up, the system will already have moved.